Thanks very much. I'm Justin Logan. I'm the Director of Defense and Foreign Policy Studies here at Cato. And I'm very pleased to be joined by Marc Trachtenberg, Professor Emeritus at UCLA, much renowned for his work on the early Cold War, in addition to a paper published by the Cato Institute last year titled, Is There Life After NATO? ? It's always good to have question marks in titles. It's an evocative way. And of course, my colleague Josh Shifrinson, professor at University of Maryland. And what is your official title?
I think I'm a non-resident senior fellow.
Something or other.
Yeah, senior poobah.
We're here to talk about NATO today. The NATO ministerial is happening. The Munich Security Conference is happening. And I wanted to start from a sort of general subject and then work our way down to sort of more specific. Marc, in this paper last year, you talked a little bit about, or quite significantly, about the way that history has been used to guide U.S. policy on NATO, U.S. policy on Europe. Can you give a little bit of a discussion of what you think has gone wrong and why?
What role should history play as we grapple with these issues relating to the future of NATO, future of the relationship the United States has with the European countries? I think the role is absolutely fundamental. Let me give some examples. You may recall that the argument is often made that the United States agreed in 1949 to defend the European countries if they were subject to attack. The notion was very commonly believed that Article 5 of the NATO Treaty committed the United States to use military force to defend the NATO allies if they were the victims of Soviet aggression. Not true. All you have to do is read the text of the ratification hearings in 1949 for the North Atlantic Treaty to see that it wasn't true, to see how Secretary of State Acheson and his views and the views of other high officials have to be taken as definitive, as authoritative. They went out of their way to deny that that commitment was as solid as it was made out to be. Now, why is this important? It's important because if you ask people, why should the United States go to war if one of the NATO allies is attacked? They say, well, we signed this treaty. We made a promise. We got to keep our promise. End of story. It preempts debate about what should be the fundamental question of American foreign policy, namely, should Europe remain an American military protectorate or should it stand on its own 2 feet, right? That's number one. Number two is, if the NATO system, the system of more or less permanent American military presence in Europe, America being responsible for the defense of Europe, did develop, how did it develop? If it wasn't the product of a treaty that was signed in 1949, what then led to it? The answer there is, it was the product of a political process that unfolded over a much longer period of time, arguably from the end of the World War II in 1945 to the end of the Kennedy administration in 1963. How did it develop? Why did it develop? Not because the United States viewed itself as permanently committed to being a European power and to the defense of Europe. It developed because the United States had the opposite policy for most of the Truman period and for the entire Eisenhower period. The American goal was to create a freestanding Europe. We would remain in Europe to provide an umbrella while the Europeans came together and built up their own military forces. The goal was to have the Europeans be independent, the Europeans to defend themselves. But how can you defend yourself against a great nuclear power like the USSR without nuclear weapons? No way. The NATO countries had to acquire nuclear capabilities under that Eisenhower concept. And that included West Germany. Germany was to be helped to become a nuclear power. And of course, the effect on the Soviets was absolutely intolerable. This is the reason why the Soviets provoked the Berlin crisis in November of '58. Kennedy comes in, feels that the United States can defend Europe for the time being because we still enjoy nuclear superiority, but it's not going to last forever. We got to settle this thing before the United States loses its nuclear age. They want to deal with the Russians. What's the deal? You lay off Berlin, you accept the status quo in Europe, and we, for our part, will keep Germany non-nuclear. Because non-nuclear Germany means USSR's number one security problem in Europe is resolved. And essentially, a deal of that sort came into being in a more or less tacit way and provided the basis for a stable international system until the end of the Cold War. Well, by framing the problem in that way, you could see what the problem is for us today. That system that came into being during the Cold War as a result of the peculiar status of Berlin, division of Germany, and so on, those conditions no longer exist. Germany is unified. Berlin is no longer a problem. Why should we stay there? Why can't the Europeans defend themselves? Perfectly legitimate to grapple with those issues. And you can see how important those issues are only when you understand the historical story. So let me just end there. That's why history is important. I could go on and talk about the history of the post-1991 period, the NATO expansion policy and the effect that it had. Clearly a very important part of the story as you're trying to think, what are we supposed to do today? Right. You have to understand how we got into this mess in the first place. And if you accept these arguments, oh, it's all the fault of the Russians, and America had this policy from the start of committing itself to the defense of Europe and so on, you're not going to get a handle on the very most basic problems that we need to think about at this point in time.
Thanks, Marc. That's a great way to sort of set the table for the discussion. I'm going to yada, yada, yada over a lot of the Cold War and take us about 40 years into the future. And Josh, I want to talk to you a little bit about NATO expansion, which Marc just sort of set up. As you and I have discussed at length, as NATO expansion went on and got arguably more costly and more risky, it got more popular in the United States Congress. The round in 2003, 2004, including the Baltic states, was voted 96-0 in the Senate,
right,
to bring these countries into the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Talk a little bit about the debate or non-debate that surrounded NATO expansion at that time, what you think was missing, and what you think was driving this idea of expanding NATO to the Russian border at the time.
So the question is, what was the debate around NATO expansion, and why was it so widely popular in the United States? Well, so when NATO expansion was first floated in the 1990s and gained momentum into the 2000s and arguably until recent years, look, there were several not totally compatible ideas that were in the ecosystem, right? Some people claimed it was about consolidating American dominance in the post-Cold War space. Some people felt it was about ensuring that the Russians couldn't become the Soviet Union again and establishing bulwarks against that. Some felt it was a kind of a noblesse oblige mission of helping the Eastern European states that had been freed from the Soviet yoke, that's the narrative at the time, to find a home in the post-Cold War space. And of course, there's a degree to which I think it's true that the U.S. wanted to stick it to the European Union and find a way to stop the European Union from gaining traction as an alternative security provider. Finally, we have to remember, and this echoes what Marc was mentioning a little while ago, the U.S. wasn't, after World War II, the U.S. to a very large degree was dragged kicking and screaming into European security affairs, right? As Marc alluded to, as we know from history, the U.S. always, many American policymakers wanted to get involved with Europe only temporarily and then get out and retain something of a free hand. Well, after the Cold War, many American policymakers thought that retreating was anathema. And so therefore they saw NATO expansion as a useful brand to keep the U.S. actively involved in international affairs. And so whereas the first round of NATO expansion actually saw a debate around those issues, by the time you get to the 2000s and later, the die has been cast. To whatever extent American policymakers in the Congress and the executive branch were willing to question their preconceptions, there was a policymaking consensus that, again, didn't always have the same purposes for NATO expansion, but these different arguments were so intertwined, laid out in such public forum, and were so easy for everyone to get involved with and get on board with, that there was no pushback. And as you say, we have congressional debates that are 96-0, literally congressional hearings that never take place, that are, the debate is over voice vote and never actually debated in the Congress as to how expansion will be carried out, how the U.S. will service its security commitments. And indeed, I think these are some of the questions that needed to be grappled with at the time. What exactly is the American interest in the future of Estonia, of Latvia, of Lithuania? Is this an issue that the U.S. wants to stake its credibility to? Because after all, if the U.S. says, I am willing to consider an Article 5 promise to these countries, and then Article 5 is called due and the U.S. responds in certain ways, there can be questions over the future of American credibility. There's a question over how the U.S. will service militarily security commitments at a time when the U.S. is drawing down on the one hand and these countries are far away and hard to grapple with on the other hand. There's a question over opportunity cost. What else could the U.S. be doing with its scarce time and resources and budgets? All these issues should have been raised systematically at every round of NATO expansion. To the extent that they were flagged at all, they were really flagged only in the first round of expansion in 1997 or so. Even then, if you read the congressional record, they are stilted debates where only people who are in favor of NATO expansion really get the time of day. And after that point, there are no further policymaking conversations. And one of the more egregious examples, when the U.S. is debating the second major round of expansion back in 2002, 2003, the congressional hearing is literally segmented with debates over the Iraq War.
Yes.
Where you have policymakers not given the time, the space, the opportunity to really grapple with the issues, and to the extent that people in the Defense Department are asked, how will you see these commitments through? They give non-responses because they have something else to focus the Congress upon.
I mean, the round of accession that, again, included the Baltic states was entirely comprised of laudatory remarks about these countries having sent troops to Iraq or other theaters in the global war on terror.
Well, in some ways, it's even worse than that. There's a line in one of the congressional hearings when then Senator Biden is asking then Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs, Ian Brzezinski, whether this will be a net gain, whether taking the Baltic states into NATO will be a net gain. And Senator Biden refers to Brzezinski as his good friend, and Brzezinski just responds, "Yes, Senator, I can guarantee this will be a net gain for the United States." That's it. That's it. No further probing of the issue. It's as if the Washington foreign policy establishment is self-lobotomized.
Ex-catheter pronouncement. Please, Marc.
There's this whole issue of how the NATO expansion policy of the 1990s and the first part of the new decade is to be understood. My sense at the time was that support for NATO expansion was a mile wide and an inch deep. I don't think it really engaged people in the country as a whole.
That's true.
It was a policy that was promulgated by a bipartisan elite, right? When you want to understand what the future of that policy is, the future of that consensus is, you have to look at these extraordinary changes that have taken place in American political life over the past 20 years. That the elite policy, of which NATO expansion was a key part, is rejected by half the country.
Right.
Half the country, which is bound to come to power half the time and pursue a very different sort of policy. When you look at the data on the shift in opinion among Republicans, it's absolutely extraordinary. The old-fashioned, quote, internationalists, unquote, Republicans, people like Mitch McConnell, they're on their way out. They no longer have support from the Republican base. They still are in the Senate. They still have a certain role to play, but they see the handwriting on the wall. And that means that this policy is not going to be universally accepted the way it was in the past, in large part because of the mess that it has led the United States into. It does not sit well with ordinary people.
There's one other element I think I want to flag because it dovetails with what Marc just said. We also have to understand NATO expansion as something of a victory disease, right? After the end of the Cold War, the U.S. was it. It was the superpower. It was the unipole. And under those conditions, you can entertain a lot of semi-foolish ideas and not have to think about how you're going to service them, how you're going to actually pay for them when the bill comes due. You know, the contrast here, I think, should be between post-Cold War NATO expansion and rollback in the 1950s. When you think about rollback in the 1950s, getting the Soviets out of Eastern Europe, everyone knew that was going to cause a nuclear war. So the times when the U.S. flirted with the idea and you began to reach a little bit, and your hand began to feel warm as you approached the fire, you pulled back. After the Cold War, there's no fire. There's nothing to push you back. And so to Marc's point, it's easy to be a mile wide and an inch deep when you don't have to think about the costs involved. Lo and behold, as you approach the Russian border, as the Russians have the ability to push back a bit more, and as there are other things you may want to spend your time, blood, treasure, and attention on, the costs of doing this darn thing go up, and people begin to sober up a little bit. The victory hubris begins to look not as nice in the cold light of day.
And, to go back to this, my hobby horse here about the expansion 2003, the military requirements of defending the Baltic states from Russia did not come up once.
Right.
It's not hyperbole. It didn't come up.
NATO
this
did
is
not
statesmanship. I want to talk a little bit about, we've talked about how the sort of burden of defending NATO has expanded as NATO itself expanded, but we're now having a discussion increasingly, thank goodness, about shifting that larger burden onto some of our wards, I think, our European wards. The President Trump has now said that he thinks that European NATO members should spend 5% of GDP on defense. I, as a sort of think tank dork, have always found those debates unsatisfying, because a percent of GDP is a kind of arbitrary measure. But, as Marc's work has illuminated, and yours too, Josh, the earlier view of burden sharing wasn't just a sort of actuarial percentage of GDP. There was, as Marc's pointed out, this idea that there should be a third force, right? That Europe should stand on its own. So to start with Josh and then maybe to go to Marc, what do you make of the current contours of the debate about burden sharing? Is it this sort of pinched, paying your fair share and then we'll keep the alliance as it exists today? Or do you think it could develop into something that is more comprehensive, where the United States really hands Europe off to the Europeans for the large part?
So how should we think about burden sharing in the contemporary age? Look, the debate over percentage of GDP spent on defense is the worst way to think about burden sharing. At the end of the day, you don't need to, you can spend a lot of money on defense and not have anything useful militarily. You can buy, you can spend 5% on defense and have nothing but infantrymen armed with small rifles. This is not a way of thinking about defense. We need to think about burden sharing, not in terms of the percentage or how many people under arms, but in terms of what hard capabilities the European countries have to provide security on the European continent. And when I say that, I don't mean capabilities that can round out what the United States can bring to bear. I mean, we should be thinking about capabilities in terms of, okay, if the continent of Europe has to provide security for itself because it has concerns of its own, of whatever variety, and there's a sense that the United States can't, shouldn't, or simply won't be the security provider of last or first resort, then the question becomes, what hard capabilities does Europe need to have indigenously to provide security upon the continent? And when we think about defense spending and burden sharing, we ought to be taking prudential steps to encourage the Europeans not to simply buy more stuff, but to buy the stuff that they themselves need to provide security for themselves at times and places of their own choosing. It echoes what we wanted to do in the early Cold War, where the plan was the U.S. would provide a temporary security shield while the states of Western Europe figured out how to pool their resources to stand up against the Soviet Union. And we ought to be thinking more seriously about what that looks like in the modern age, in a world where there is no Soviet Union, but many of the European countries seem to have security concerns that they would like to see the United States do for them, and I would like to see the Europeans do more for themselves.
Jimmy Carter tried to withdraw U.S. ground troops from South Korea. And I think as you look back at that experience, you learn a number of things. There was an article that I read that said the deep state prevented Jimmy Carter from withdrawing from Korea. But if you look at it, there was an intelligence analysis that was done in the U.S. intelligence community that said the balance of forces on the Korean Peninsula is actually not beneficial, and South Korea might fall if U.S. forces were withdrawn. The Japanese didn't like the idea of U.S. forces withdrawing from Korea. So there was this sort of concerted effort by American bureaucracies, international bureaucracies, and foreign government bureaucracies to stymie this project, and it worked. And so when I think about the NATO bureaucracy itself, which after all should give some latitude to U.S. prerogatives, I think if you had a forceful burden shifting effort on the part of the Trump administration, that NATO bureaucracy itself would fight tooth and nail to prevent that, to protect the status quo. So does anybody, first of all, want to just reject out of hand my analogy to the South Korea experience in the 70s? Or secondly, talk a little bit about how these institutions that have built up over 60, 70 years might respond to a presidency that has a very different understanding of how Europe should be defended.
Justin raised the whole issue of the Jimmy Carter's attempt to withdraw from Korea and how it was frustrated. Why was it frustrated? This is not my area of expertise, so maybe I'm on thin ice here. But if you'd say America should withdraw from South Korea, it inevitably raises the whole issue of should South Korea develop nuclear forces of its own? And that has all sorts of implications about America's general non-proliferation policy, America's policy vis-a-vis China, vis-a-vis Japan, Taiwan, as well as North Korea. You have to think these things through as part of a whole comprehensive set of problems. And that was something that Jimmy Carter was just not very good at, to put it mildly. I studied a little bit about the Carter administration. It's absolutely appalling. I mean, in terms of just technical incompetence of how they proceeded. Just your jaw just sometimes drops. Does this have any bearing on other issues? Well, I don't think it bears on the deep state issue too much. The deep state issue does have a certain bearing on these questions. Trump wanted a better relationship with Russia in his first term. He was prevented from going that route by all sorts of efforts that were made by unelected bureaucrats, especially from the intelligence organizations, to thwart that policy. And they were successful in doing it. The implication of all this for us now is that Trump was outraged by that, as he had every right to be, by the way. And so what you will see this time around is he's not going to fall into that same trap. He's not going to surround himself with people who are in favor of taking a tough line vis-a-vis Russia and so on. So people learn from their experiences. And when he was thwarted by the bureaucracy the first time, I don't think he's going to allow himself to be thwarted by these people in his second and final term.
And I think there's going to be a concerted effort to end the war in Ukraine on terms that I think it's reasonable to believe will not make Kyiv particularly happy. And will not make the Europeans particularly happy. I think the Europeans have been quite happy to keep the spigot open forever until something happy comes about in Ukraine. But we have the U.S. administration having now said that Ukraine is on an irreversible path to NATO membership. Josh, I want to push you on this a little bit, and you can encapsulate the other answer that you had chambered there in the same thing. So you and I have been in more meetings with more European delegations over the last year or so than we had previously, I think it's fair to say. And a lot of these are couched as, well, we want to get together and talk about burden sharing. And I always ask myself, why do the Europeans want to talk to American scholars about burden sharing? They know my views about how these burdens should be shared, and they probably shouldn't like my views. And it's become clear that they're trying to reverse engineer various plans for burden shifting to try to figure out how to stymie them. So can you talk a little bit about that in addition to European irrelevance vis-a-vis ending the Ukraine war?
So how are the Europeans thinking about burden sharing on the one hand, and how might that factor into the end of an American attempt to end the Russia-Ukraine war? Well, look, if you were going to put a gun to my head, and I imagine if it's a European gun, they may even have bullets these days, then I would suspect that the Europeans are trying to figure out, A, how to performatively suggest that they're spending more in defense to appease the Trump party line, but then B, and this would be the more I think, conniving solution. That's what I would do if I were in their situation. I would be acquiring capabilities to show that I can contribute more to European defense, but if and only if the United States stays involved. In other words, round out capabilities, a phrase that we used to use during the Cold War. Things that would complement, things that would reinforce what the U.S. would bring to the table, such that the Europeans can stand up and say, yes, we are doing more for defense, but then also turn around in the same breath and say to the United States, but you need to stick around, otherwise this whole cockamamie scheme will collapse. It's what I would imagine they're trying to reverse engineer. But that also, in a weird way, connects to the ending or the possible ending of the Russia-Ukraine war. Because Marc's point here is that the Europeans don't matter. I happen to agree with that when it comes to the ending of the war. But I also think some of the recent moves in the United States and also in Europe actually may create conditions where it's easier for the United States to bring the Europeans on board to an ending of the war. Look, we've had, for rightly or wrongly, for a variety of reasons, a rise of European apathy towards the war. We see in political events in Hungary, in Germany, Poland, France, parties that don't really support the party line on aid to Ukraine rising in popularity. We know that the German economic model is under duress. That's going to have an effect on providing aid to Ukraine. All this is to say, and on the macro level, the United States is signaling repeatedly under both Biden and Trump that the United States may not want to be involved to the same degree in Europe in perpetuity, and certainly is not willing to fight for the future of Ukraine. All of which is to say, the European members of NATO may be facing a pretty stark choice. Take steps to take steps to help yourself and prepare for a situation where the U.S. may not be willing to stick around in the same degree in the future, which requires investing in yourself, or continue aiding Ukraine, knowing that that's going to actually exacerbate the clash of the United States. And under those conditions, it's not implausible at all to imagine many European capitals going along with an American effort to ratchet down the Russia-Ukraine war, simply because the war has reached its natural end state in many ways.
Yes, but the issue is it just this narrow issue of the Ukraine war?
Right.
Or is it this larger issue?
Right. Well, look, go ahead.
The interesting thing to watch for with the Europeans is, are they seriously grappling with the larger issue of should Europe be strategically independent?
Right.
These conversations that you've had with these European officials or whoever they were, these deal with what are ultimately trivial issues. You know, exactly how much should we spend and how, and so. The real issues, which people don't want to talk about, is if Europe is going to stand on its own, and Russia is still a major nuclear power, don't the Europeans need nuclear capabilities of their own? You can't really stand up in the final analysis if push comes to shove, if you're
a non-nuclear power.
A non-nuclear. Do we want to go that route, right? Should we encourage it? Should we encourage, in general, a European strategic autonomy within the Western alliance, either as a final step or as an interim measure to something more complete, feeling our way forward? Those are the core issues that people should concern themselves with, but people don't want to. They want to shy away from this stuff. You know, the whole notion of Germany should never be allowed to acquire a nuclear capability. You don't want to come near that question. It's radioactive, both for the Germans and for Germany's partners, because to say Germany should remain non-nuclear is basically saying, no matter how you people have behaved since 1945, we still don't trust you.
And I think on the defense industrial base question, the Trump administration has a real dilemma.
Yes.
Because they want the Europeans to spend more on American material for sort of transactional economic reasons.
Right.
And I think that the idea that the Europeans are going to really ramp up spending and buy mostly or exclusively American kit is not likely to happen. I think they're going to demand some of the economic benefit of that.
You can't have both AfD and the former Le Pen party demanding more of a traditional European economic model and lots of spending on the American defense industrial base. Those two things don't go together. And I would hope that any politician in Germany, France, Poland, and beyond knows that one way to pull some of the air out of the AFD et al. System is to spend more on defense at home. It would be a rational response.
Well, there we have it. I think that's a great place on which to end. I want to thank Marc Trachtenberg and Josh Shifrinson for being here, and look forward to seeing this all unfold in the coming weeks and months.
Well, thanks for having us. It was great.
This was fun.
I love talking about this stuff.
That's good.